I hope you're having a fantastic time at the Swell Conference. Our next session lead is Alexandra Zhu, who is a junior at Rutgers Prep. She's the vice president of her school's history club, an editor for the school newspaper, and a leader of the Ethics Bowl team. She's also a member of the varsity girls soccer team and has played classical piano for over 11 years. One of her greatest passions in life is running her Instagram account at AlexFoodFreedom, where she engages in eating disorder and mental health activism and discusses topics at the intersection of social justice and public health. Her work has led her to be featured in book clubs, magazines, websites, podcasts, and more. She's incredibly excited and grateful to be a speaker for the 2020 Swell Conference. Without further ado, I give you Body Positivity, Eating Disorders, and their link to social justice with Miss Alexandra Zhu.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction. I am truly honored to be able to speak with you all today. These are certainly unprecedented times, and given the extremely stressful nature of this day and age, with the coronavirus pandemic, United States elections, and more, our collective mental health is definitely suffering. We likely possess a heightened desire to follow every bit of news, to be perpetually productive. We may experience a sense of social isolation and disconnection, as well as struggle to adjust to a daily schedule that consists largely of staring at a screen for hours. Thus, it is absolutely imperative that we make mental health and the expansion of access to quality mental health care a foremost priority. I deeply admire the work that the SWL movement and all of my fellow speakers are doing to instigate conversations concerning mental wellness. To begin with, let's talk a little bit about anorexia nervosa. This is likely the illness that most people think of when they hear eating disorder. Anorexia is associated with the restriction of energy intake or specific food groups, resulting in significant weight loss. There's an intense fear of gaining weight or becoming fat, as well as a disturbance in the way one perceives their body weight and shape, or the denial of the seriousness of one's condition. An individual who struggles with anorexia is highly preoccupied with food, and this typically manifests through desire to cook elaborate meals for others without eating themselves, developing food rituals, and more. Many folks with anorexia engage in excessive, compulsive exercise, which partially accounts for the high comorbidity rate for anorexia and OCD, and exhibits social isolation. From a physical standpoint, anorexia is also incredibly destructive. Symptoms include gastrointestinal complaints, fainting, dizziness, menstrual irregularities, thinning of hair, and muscle weakness. Many anorexia patients experience some form of osteoporosis, which creates an increased risk of breaks and fractures. In the long term, women may be faced with a complete cessation of menstruation and thus infertility. The mortality rate of anorexia nervosa is exorbitantly high at 10%, making it the most fatal mental disorder. While many individuals die from starvation and metabolic collapse, others die of suicide. I feel that there exists a deeply spurious notion of the typical anorexia patient as being thin, straight, white, and female. In truth, the illusory construct of a typical patient must be eradicated altogether. Anorexia, like other eating disorders, does not discriminate. In fact, certain eating disorders disproportionately affect marginalized groups, which I'll get into more later. Right now, I would like to zone in on the specific misassociation of anorexia and eating disorders in general with thinness and emaciation. Here are some examples of what you get when you search up anorexia. Images of these thin white girls. I chose not to include images that depicted emaciation, as those could be quite triggering, but there are plenty of them. The simple reality is that anorexia is not inextricably tied to a certain body type. The association of anorexia with thinness is not only flawed, but also truly dangerous. A study from the Journal of Adolescent Health revealed that approximately 1/3 of adolescent patients hospitalized for complications of anorexia were not underweight as determined by the BMI scale. Another study, this time conducted at the University of California, San Francisco, revealed that young adults categorized as obese are actually 3.5 times more likely to engage in disordered eating behaviors, yet only half as likely to receive a clinical diagnosis. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual includes a section on an illness deemed atypical anorexia. By definition, those with allegedly atypical anorexia meet all criteria for anorexia nervosa, despite significant and potentially deadly weight loss. The individual's weight is within or above the so-called normal range. Research corroborates the fact that the physical and psychological complications of atypical anorexia do not differ in severity from the complications of anorexia for those in bodies considered underweight. Atypical anorexia, which is actually 4 times more common than so-called typical anorexia, is just as excruciating, just as debilitating, if not even more so. In a study by the Mayo Clinic, over 1/3 of adolescents presenting with an eating disorder had a BMI history above the 85th percentile. These individuals had the longest duration of illness and the most dramatic decrease in BMI prior to presentation, as healthcare practitioners did not deem them sick enough to receive actual treatment. Notably, their symptoms were just as severe and prevalent in number as the symptoms of those who did not have a history of high BMI. Patients who do not fit the construct of the classic anorexia patient frequently internalize beliefs about not being sick enough and may relish praise that their friends, families, and doctors shower them with for their apparent commitment to getting healthier and losing weight. They are also often discharged early from treatment programs. All of this serves to exacerbate the disorder. What contributes to the fallacious correlation of anorexia and other eating disorders, which I'll discuss later, with emaciation, and the marginalization of eating disorder patients in larger bodies? I would argue the mainstream representation of anorexia, the alarming ignorance of healthcare providers, as only a limited amount of time is spent on eating disorders in medical school, and weight stigma. Weight stigma is discrimination or stereotyping, based on a person's weight. Research demonstrates that weight stigma is linked to a 60% increase in mortality risk regardless of baseline BMI, which makes it a substantial public health threat. Most individuals frame their stigmatizing, discriminatory language and behavior as stemming from concern about a fat person's health. Some go as far as to say that fat shaming is an altruistic, productive activity because it encourages fat folks to pursue weight loss and take control of their health. Yet time and time and again, weight stigma has been associated with the common psychological and physiological correlates of stressful social situations. Thus, it elevates the risk of high blood pressure, inflammation, and metabolic syndrome, and it contributes to psychological distress and increased social isolation. Furthermore, contrary to popular belief, weight stigma actually breeds avoidance of health-promoting behaviors. Those in high weight bodies are perceived as lazy, irresponsible, and unorganized. They receive lower wages and fewer promotions, and they are subjected to unjust hiring practices. Furthermore, they endure harassment from colleagues. Weight discrimination in the workplace is legal in every single state in the United States except Michigan. The medical field is certainly not immune to weight stigma either. Reporting feelings of repulsion, healthcare practitioners spend less time with and provide less health advice to obese patients and regard them as undisciplined and non-compliant. In a Huffington Post article, journalist Michael Hobbs speaks of an anesthesiologist who reported that surgeons often trade high school insults when a larger person is on the operating table. It makes sense then, the higher weight individuals are often avoidant of healthcare settings. Weight discrimination differs from numerous other forms of discrimination, in the sense that while one's close friends and family often provide emotional support in stressful situations, an individual's loved ones and intimate friends are often major perpetuators of weight stigma. This leads to internalized shame, which in turn disrupts well-being and increases the likelihood of disordered eating and exercise behaviors. In her book, Fat Talk, The Human Cause of America's War on Fat, Susan Greenhalgh, professor of anthropology at Harvard University, illustrates the brutality of weight stigma through autoethnography, a research method in which reflective writings regarding one's life experiences are used by the researcher for cultural, social, and political analysis. The pages teem with gut-wrenching stories and disparaging comments from friends, of mothers refusing to speak to overweight daughters imprisoned in a ceaseless cycle of weight loss and weight gain, and physicians advising children who have not yet reached puberty to count every calorie, to measure every inch of fat. Young persons exposed to such abusive fat talk from physicians, peers, and relatives desperately fear social marginalization and rejection. They internalize the loathing messages bombarded at them and craft a narrative in which all their problems stem from fat and can thus be resolved through weight loss. Dangerous weight loss methods are frequently employed, producing results that immediately attract praise from those whose validation matters most. Yet the weight is almost surely regained due to the fact that we have yet to discover a weight loss method that ensures permanent, sustainable weight loss for the majority of people. Countless research demonstrates that weight loss is maximal at 6 to 12 months after beginning an intervention, but most weight is regained within 2 years. By the 5-year mark, most individuals have returned to their initial body weight. The National Health and Medical Research Council of Australia corroborated this finding with a level A statement, the highest possible level of certainty, as you can see here on the screen. Unfortunately, the public passionately maintains that lasting weight loss can be achieved by any individual, a conviction eloquently described by Ann Becker of Harvard Medical School as inexhaustible consumer optimism, and personal agency via weight. So weight regain is associated with great frustration and disappointment, and the person in question is trapped in a draining sequence of weight loss and regain. The only way an individual can maintain their desired weight is typically through extreme suppression and restriction. This incites a downward spiral into an eating disorder. That brings me right up to the next eating disorder I want to discuss, bulimia nervosa. Like anorexia, bulimia is marked by preoccupation with weight loss as well as dieting and control of food. A key distinction is that individuals with bulimia engage in recurrent episodes of binge eating, followed by compensatory behavior such as self-induced vomiting, laxative use, excessive exercise, etc. Those with bulimia often disappear after eating, steal or hoard food in strange places, and exhibit an excessive intake of water, mouthwash, gum, and mints. They experience extreme mood swings, fluctuations in weight, and suffer the same deleterious physical effects as people with anorexia nervosa. Next is binge eating disorder, which is characterized by consumption of large amounts of food in a discrete period of time while feeling out of control, at least once a week for 3 months, but with the absence of inappropriate compensatory behavior. The individual experiences marked distress, social withdrawal, and extreme preoccupation with body weight and shape. There is an extremely prevalent misconception that folks with binge eating disorder lack discipline and willpower. This could not be further from the truth, and in fact creates a negative, disdainful stigma around this crippling illness. Binging often actually stems from restriction. We know that when we frame a food, or anything really, as off limits, we are much more likely to think about it and possess a strong desire for it. This is basic human psychology. Restriction through self-imposed dieting begets binging, which partially accounts for why weight loss is generally regained within 2 years, but so do externally imposed restrictions on food. In America, approximately 40 million people are impacted by food insecurity, and Black and Hispanic households are disproportionately affected. The consistent inadequacy of energy intake associated with food security is essentially perceived by the body as a famine. As I mentioned before, when deprivation is sensed, there's an overwhelming sense of physical and psychological depletion that breeds food obsession. Whenever food becomes available, a person is compelled to eat as much as possible. This is a fundamental biological drive, an innate survival mechanism passed on from ancestors who regularly experience famines. While this protective mechanism is very necessary for those residing in food-insecure households, cycles of restriction and binge eating can disrupt hunger and fullness cues and eventually lead to a full-blown binge eating disorder. However, to reduce the root causes of binge eating disorder to intentional restriction or dieting and unintentional restriction due to food insecurity would be a massive oversimplification. The root causes of all eating disorders are deeply complex, and I will only begin to scratch the surface today. We know that perfectionism, as well as anxiety and hypervigilance, predispose one to disordered eating. Eating disorders also often result from attempts to regain a sense of individual control and agency. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm pretty obsessed with One Direction, so I'm actually going to bring up Zayn Malik here. Zayn unfortunately struggled with an eating disorder during his 1D days, and he framed his illness in this matter. It was a control thing. Every area of my life was so regimented and controlled. Eating was the one area where I could say, no, I'm not eating that. This notion of control can also be related to the experience of stress, trauma, and the associated sense of shame and/or internalized oppression. According to the minority stress model, minority individuals are frequently exposed to harrowing social situations that induce stress. Over time, the stress accumulates and leads to physical, mental, and spiritual dysfunction. In the case of eating disorders, the unique stressors faced by marginalized peoples cause them to turn to disordered eating, which serves as a way to cope with trauma and numb or evade difficult emotions. In a society plagued with body obsession, eating disorder behaviors are a natural response to inordinate stress. Restriction, for example, provides a sense of control, a sense of doing something productive and beneficial for our health. One's energy is entirely devoted to limiting food intake, so distressing emotions and perturbing daily realities do not have to be dealt with. Binge eating, on the other hand, provides a temporary sense of comfort, of escape, that is then followed by crushing, paralyzing guilt, and the big cycle begins all over again. To exemplify the role of trauma and oppression in the development of eating disorders, let us look at the effect of transphobia and the consequent lack of respectful gender-affirming healthcare on transgender individuals. Failing to fund competent, unprejudiced professionals, individuals decide to manipulate their appearance on their own so as to pass as cisgender and attain a certain presentation of gender. Often, eating disorder behaviors are utilized to achieve a specific body type. People of color face equally disconcerting inequities that severely complicate their experience of eating disorders. A substantial pool of evidence indicates that ethnic minorities engage in disordered eating at elevated rates. For example, more indigenous teenagers are attempting to lose weight than in any other racial group. And African American and Hispanic teenagers are significantly more likely to experience bulimia nervosa than their Caucasian peers. A diverse set of etiologies may account for this. Most notably, people of color are the predominant victims of abuse, as well as targets of racism. These horrific phenomena are rooted in a long history of oppression against people of color, from the brutal genocide of indigenous peoples and theft of their sacred lands to the abhorrent institution of slavery. Today, we by no means live in a post-racial society. Covert and overt violence against Black and individual folks is incredibly pervasive. Eating disorders not only serve as coping mechanisms in these situations, but also as a means of potentially increasing one's proximity to whiteness, and thus ensuring one's acceptance and safety in a fundamentally dangerous world. To elaborate on this point, allow me to first introduce what I often call diet or wellness culture. Under diet culture, the image of wellness and also beauty is one of thinness and whiteness. Diet culture encourages us to restrict our calories and cut out entire food groups, to equate diet and body weight with morals and character, to feel like we have to earn our food and more. The foods that are deemed clean under diet/wellness culture are very Eurocentric. There's no place for ethnic foods that possess not only nutritional value, but also extreme cultural significance. To enhance their proximity to white supremacist ideals, people of color often eschew ethnic cultural foods regarded as unhealthy, so as to achieve thinness and thus health. This often contributes to the development of eating disorders. The cultural narrative that obesity is a primary cause of disease in Black folks keeps Black individuals striving for thinness and also enables the most privileged in society to neglect the social inequities that actually worsen health outcomes and create health disparities in Black communities. I also need to mention that there would be no diet culture without racism and colonialism. I highly encourage you to check out Sabrina String's book, Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fat Phobia, for more on this. Essentially, with the spread of Protestantism and the rise of the transatlantic slave trade, racial scientific rhetoric about slavery linked fatness to allegedly greedy Africans, and religious discourse claimed that overeating was ungodly. In the US, fatness thus became stigmatized as both Black and sinful, and slenderness served as a marker of moral, racial, and national superiority. Anyway, despite the fact that people of color experience eating disorders more frequently, they are far less likely to be clinically diagnosed. This applies to Black women in particular. In a dismaying 2006 study, clinicians were placed into 3 groups. Each group was presented with an identical case study exhibiting symptoms of disordered eating. But each group received a client of a different race, either white, Hispanic, or Black. 44% of clinicians regarded the white woman's eating behavior as problematic, and 41% thought so about the Hispanic woman. In contrast, only 17% of clinicians believed that the Black woman's behavior was problematic. Evidently, fallacious race-based assumptions about eating disorders, resulting from the notion that African Americans are more immune to these illnesses, impede equitable healthcare delivery. Overall, a major issue when it comes to eating disorder treatment is the lack of culturally competent, trauma-informed practitioners who explore unique factors such as the patient's history of trauma, including a cultural stress, racism, poverty, abuse, and more, and who actually understand the role of food and the general attitudes surrounding food and body within an individual's culture. This is why we need more Black, Indigenous, and people of color individuals holding positions as physicians, nurses, dietitians, therapists, and more. And we also need healthcare providers in general who are trained on how to provide culturally sensitive care and understand how cultural values and norms may affect a patient's struggles, treatment process, as well as how they describe their own symptoms. There's also a fundamental lack of research on the effectuality of various treatment strategies when they're applied to minorities. We need our mental health providers and our research samples to reflect the diversity of the populations we are serving. That brings me to my last topic for today, the body positivity movement. I've noticed that this movement is usually framed as being about loving your body. I am in no way suggesting that the work being done to promote self-love is not significant. That's definitely a huge component of what I do. However, this whitewashed narrative of self-love espoused by thin white women who only have a few rolls when bending over misses the mark. In reality, body positivity is a movement founded by Black, queer women, and femmes. It aims to dismantle the systems of oppression that frame marginalized bodies as somehow undesirable, unworthy, inherently polluted, that perpetuate inequality, that attempt to socially and politically exclude people of color, fat folks, LGBTQ plus individuals, disabled folks, and more. Body positivity is hence fundamentally intersectional and rooted in principles of liberation and social justice. It cannot be equated with self-love and body image work, which I must stress once again is still absolutely crucial. Okay, well, I've speeded through a lot today, but I feel like I still have so much more to cover. I hope my presentation today was insightful, and please do not hesitate to reach out with any questions. Feel free to check out @AlexFoodFreedom on Instagram, where I go into things like these in much greater detail. You can shoot a message to me over Instagram or email me at alexandraxu77@gmail.com. Thank you so much for your attention today, and I urge you all to continue to prioritize your mental health and practice self-care and self-compassion. Sending you lots of love, and thank you once again. And here, real quick, are some of my works cited. Thank you.